Good morning, everyone. We are waiting for everyone to join the meeting, and we'll get started in just a few moments. We're so glad y'all are joining us today. As a reminder, we do have a chat feature and a Q&A feature in the Zoom, so if you're having any technical difficulties for any reason, you can add those to the chat, and myself and Haley will try to troubleshoot. And we will get started in just a few moments here once we're sure that everyone's joined the meeting. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. All right, and we're going to give it just a few more minutes here and make sure that everyone's joined. I've been told that my mic is a little low, so I'm going to hold it right by my mouth here. And hopefully that is better for everyone. And again, we will have the program start in just a few moments. If you have questions throughout the program, please feel free to add those to the Q&A or the chat. And if you have any technical difficulties during the program, feel free to add those to the chat as well. And myself and Haley will attempt to help that with your enjoyment of the program. We'll just give it just a few more moments here to make sure that everyone's joined.
Yes, she is. Cozy, I have a presentation right now.
Okay, so I think that everyone has joined. So welcome so much to our June program of our curator conversation. My name is Elizabeth Darling, and I'm the manager of membership and annual giving here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And I'm so glad that you all have joined us today. We are pleased to introduce you to our newest curator, Brittany Hutchinson, and she will give a presentation today on secret agency. And before I turn it over to her, if you didn't hear me earlier, we will have a Q&A section at the end of the program. You can add those questions as they come up throughout the program to the Q&A feature or to the chat, or you can save those for the end as well. So to introduce Brittany Hutchinson, she will give a bit more of a detailed biography of herself. But Brittany comes to us from the Chicago History Museum, and she has also worked at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., as well as the Chicago Children's Museum. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Brittany, and we look forward to the program.
Good morning. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for passing it over. Again, my name is Brittany Hutchinson. I'm the newest curator here at the VMHC. And so originally when I was asked to give this talk, it was supposed to be sort of an introduction to who I am as a person, which I can't imagine talking about myself for an hour. So I tried to make this into sort of an introduction to my work and how I tend to process history and work within history. So a little bit about me before I kind of get started. I attended Wayne State University, where I majored in anthropology with a focus in bioarchaeology. From there, I joined the Campsville Field School, where I focused again in bioarchaeology. I got my master's degree in museum studies and historical preservation from Morgan State University, where I focused in historical archaeology. And of course, I entered the museum industry, and I've been working in museum education, community engagement, as well as curatorial. So I'm really happy to join the team at the VMHC. And so for this talk, again, it's an introduction of sorts. So I decided to go with a topic that relates to what it is that I study and research, which is African American history, particularly history that relates to Black women and resistance. I also focus in popular culture and social history. So in doing so, I like to engage with present scholarship coming directly from academic circles, as well as oral history interpretation. So you'll see a bit of that here in this talk. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started to our next slide. This is, of course, Secret Agencies, what this is titled. And this is really about sort of how African Americans, and particularly African American women, engaged in resistance during the Civil War and sort of the time leading up to it. So this first part of the conversation kind of gives us that lead into what Black women end up doing during the Civil War. And we have to start with 1830 and the Colored Convention movement. Now, beginning in 1830s, we see lots of African Americans, free Blacks actually, convening together to discuss ways in which they can resist both slavery and inequity in society. So this is a quote from the Constitution of the American Society of Free Persons of Color. We have been led to the following conclusions: that our forlorn and deplorable situation earnestly and loudly demand of us to devise and pursue all legal means for the speedy evolution of ourselves and brethren to the scale of standing men. Next slide, please. So a bit about this sort of convention. These conventions were networks that span across the US, mainly the East Coast and Midwest and a little bit in the South, but they were bodies of folks who wanted to talk about how to engage with political activity to elevate African Americans out of slavery and sort of out of the sort of depressed and repressed place in society. We see that this activism spreads rapidly over the 30 years prior to the Civil War and a little bit afterward. It kind of dies down from that point. So this was a space where both African American and white Americans wanted to get together to fight slavery and fight inequity. This is also a space where white abolitionists could be vetted by Black abolitionists, where ideas that spanned from, developing a colony or spaces in Canada to buying land up there to actually moving to Caribbean countries to sort of get away from or fight discrimination in the US. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So the beginning of this movement really starts in Philadelphia in earnest with Mother Bethel, and that's the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was founded by Richard Allen. And so Richard Allen was born into slavery and was able to free himself and became a minister and preacher within the Methodist tradition and established a church in 1787, which was the first to sort of exist in the United States. And this church, Mother Bethel, as it's called, still stands today. This was the first location for that first convention that we saw the Constitution for a moment ago. And it's kind of sparked that movement across the US. People from across different countries or different states came to Philadelphia, to Mother Bethel, to speak and to share ideas, where they set up their constitution, their board of directors, and how they would engage with each other in business. And so this is really the beginning of this movement of colored conventions in the United States. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of the documentation from that first meeting. As you can see on the right panel there, you have folks from Philadelphia, New York, Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia who have come to Philadelphia to have this conversation and to join this convention. And so this is all these sources are from the Colored Conventions Project, which is through Cornell University, and they have quite a bit of material related to this entire movement, everything from women's activity within the movement to exactly what types of conversations are being had. A lot of the material that we see in this movement is against what was known as the sort of the initiative to return enslaved Africans to Africa, which was something that was across both the aisle of folks who were abolitionists and folks who were pro-slavery. This sort of was seen as the solution to the quote unquote problem of African Americans in the United States, to return people to Africa, a place where they had never been or lived. So, okay, sorry, we go to the next slide. So within this conversation of, lots of people coming together, what was quite unique about the colored conventions movement was sort of the presence of women and their role within this movement. So there are some articles and documents pertaining to how women were sort of encouraged to speak up and speak out. And one of those women was Maria Stewart, who started to operate early on prior to the convention movement and sort of alongside it as well. And so her involvement really early on, she became known as America's first Black woman political writer. And really, she was giving lectures and talks before women of any race were doing so in the United States. And she started, of course, in Philadelphia and a little bit in Boston as well. So Maria Stewart was born in 1803 in Connecticut, of middle class, free Black parents. And she started out as a teacher, but became very much committed to her religious journey and tradition, and had this close relationship to God. And part of her worship and her fellowship within her religious practice was very much aligned with abolition. She saw abolition and equality work, and sort of this radical equality work, as part of her duty, as part of her Christianity, and it was very much present in her language and in her talks. So this is a photo from the very first speech of hers that turned out to be published in The Liberator, which is an abolitionist newspaper that was spearheaded by William Lloyd Garrison. So in this conversation, much of her language is of, biblical in nature, but calls people to stand up and to sort of fight against this sort of type of oppression that everyone's sort of experiencing. What makes her talks and her speeches so unique is that at this time, a lot of abolitionists were speaking to white audiences and trying to convince, white audiences to join the anti-slavery abolitionist movement, whereas Stewart was speaking directly to Black audiences. She tailored her language and her speeches to Black audiences because she wanted to not only, argue for abolition and for equality, but she felt that engaging with other Black folks and building up the sort of network of information and sort of instilling in everyone the awareness of exactly how to engage with abolition was important. So much so that in 1832, a short time after this pamphlet was published, she started what was called the African American Female Intelligence Society. And so this society was, of course, comprised entirely of Black women. And the purpose was to increase literacy. It was also to share ideas and to practice writing political and also just, writing in general, but to practice writing political statements and to show how to have your material published to speak out against slavery and speak out against acts of inequality. So she engaged in this work in such a way that was, again, somewhat ruffling to some folks, because again, she's speaking to Black audiences in particular. She was very, very, for her time, very radical. She made quite a few enemies in her work, but she, in her sort of a longer sort of view of what she was able to accomplish, this network that she set up amongst Black women also served as a way to share ideas and share information that could help Black women sort of liberate themselves. So it wasn't just about abolition, it was about sort of women's liberation at a very, very early stage in the sort of the colored conventions movement. She went on to write quite a bit. Much of her writings were published in The Liberator. And she did eventually, over time, she unfortunately passed away with very little money because of her outspoken nature. We can go to the next slide. So this is sort of the crux of the talk, and where we're kind of getting into a lot of this sort of scholarship and research and kind of bringing that larger view of how the colored convention movement sort of distilled down and what it looked like on the ground, so to speak. So we're going to spend some time here with this slide and kind of dissect this quote. And this is from a book, really sort of a volume called "All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave," and it's a sort of cornerstone of Black feminist writing that talks about a lot of the things that we're seeing happening within this period of time and sort of how Black women are engaging with resistance. So the quote here from Elizabeth Higginbotham is, "It is essential to overcome the legacy of misunderstanding Black women, perceiving them as either inadequate or as superwomen, which has been fostered by biased research." So what she's alluding to is, of course, this volume was written in the 70s. what she's alluding to, sort of like the presence of Black women in certain spheres of understanding in our society, but the absolute absence in others. So this is something we're going to see, I believe, on the next slide. Next slide. I don't think that's the slide we're looking for, but we're going to see this sort of play out in different ways. So this is a photo of, obviously we have a family here. This is Jefferson Davis's family. And in the background, we of course have a Black woman who was either a servant or enslaved. It's not quite clear from the material that that accompanied this image. And so this is the dynamic that we're sort of talking about within this time period. We're discussing invisibility and hypervisibility, which is a seemingly contradictory concept, but it does play out quite a bit, and we're going to investigate that a bit and as we move forward with the next slide. There we go. So this is some scholarly research. As I mentioned before, a lot of my work sort of stems from scholarly research in different areas of scholarship in academia. And this is specifically focused in feminist leisure research. And so this is a conversation about hypervisibility and invisibility that Black women experience. And so one of the examples of that would be, Serena Williams, right? We know that she's obviously a very well-known athlete, and we're familiar with some of the scrutiny she received based on her physical body, what she's wearing, how she expresses herself. But on the other side of that, when she was giving birth to her daughter, knowing her body, she is prone to blood clots. And when she tried to inform the medical staff that she was experiencing a pulmonary embolism, they, told her that she was just, delirious from the medication and didn't listen to her. So on the one hand, we have this very visible, superwoman almost in our society. But then when it comes to, can you kind of jump back to the previous slide? When it comes to sort of listening to her and her knowledge and awareness of her own body, she was ignored. And so this comes from, as sort of an example of misogynoir. And so misogynoir is a term that was coined in 2008 by scholar Moya Bailey. And so within this concept of misogynoir, which is a combination of the word misogyny and noir, which is the French word for the color Black, it's the way in which Black women experience racism and sexism at the same time. Because Black women cannot divorce themselves from their identity as Black and as women, that in order to combat different types of repression, they have to kind of consider both of those identities at the same time. So if a Black woman is going to experience sexism, there's also an element of racism involved. If a Black woman experiences racism, there's also an element of sexism involved automatically. And so within this conversation of hypervisibility and invisibility, we have to sort of see how women who are labeled as superwomen or they're hypervisible, they're hyper aware of them, that in and of itself is problematic. It is just as bad as someone who is invisible. And so doing either of these or having either view of Black women together makes or sort of compounds the issues that they face. So we can go to the next slide. So our first woman that we're going to sort of profile with this lens in this context is Mary Bowser. And her name is in quotations because that is not her name. It's one of her many names, I should say. So she's gone by a few different aliases over time. I've counted maybe 5 or 6 that I've come across in research. The most popular is Mary Bowser, but she formerly went by Mary Jane Richards Denman, which is one of the names that's listed here. And so she's one of the more popular Black women who's engaged in this work of, espionage during the Civil War, sort of as an intelligence activist and agent. And we know that, she has this larger than life story of where she was sewing sort of secret codes into some embroidery and sneaking things into the hem, sewn into the hem of her dress. But, based on the work by historian Lois Levine, those things are largely untrue. We aren't really sure exactly of what Denman was able to do, what she did, because we don't have many records specifically talking about what her activities were. We do know, of course, that she was part of an espionage ring that was run by Elizabeth Van Leeuw, which is very true. We do know that, of course, she did live in Virginia. She did serve in Jefferson Davis's house at some point. But beyond that, we aren't quite sure. So, given that information, we're finding that she has that hypervisible mythos that we talked about in the previous slide, where we have this larger than life character. A lot of her work, even though she did do some very valuable and important things, has been sort of ballooned to a level that doesn't actually speak to who she was as a person and what she actually was able to accomplish, which actually overshadows her accomplishments quite a bit. So how we're sort of engaging with Mary Denman's work is through the writings and the records of Elizabeth Van Loo, because we have very little that actually comes from Denman. And so in a diary entry from May 14th, 1864, Van Loo writes, "When I open my eyes in the morning, I say to the servant, 'What news, Mary?' And my caterer never fails. Most generally, our reliable news is gathered from Negroes, and they certainly show wisdom, discretion, and prudence, which is wonderful." So, we have this very obvious record of Van Loo engaging and sort of leading this espionage ring. But what we don't see is who are these individuals that she's sort of leading in this ring? Are they doing so willingly? Are they doing so enthusiastically? We do know that Mary was essentially the property of the Van Loo family, even though she was sent north to be educated and also sent to Liberia to serve as a missionary, where she was allowed to return because she didn't like being there. We do understand that Van Loo was eventually compensated for her services, but there's very little record of the enslaved folks and the free Black folks that she worked with or had working under in this ring were compensated. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Well, we do have actually, as of 2018, late 2018, um, there was a letter found that was authenticated by historian Lois Levine and sort of interpreted a bit by her as well. So this letter was written in 1870. It was written by M.L. Denman, who we believe is M.R. Denman, who we believe is Mary Denman. And in this letter, of course, there's a level of friendliness and familiarity that she's writing to Van Loo. And sort of it begins very lovingly, very carefully, as speaking between friends. And it kind of gives us some insight there that there was an ongoing relationship. I mean, this is 1870, so they're still in contact with each other. Was not quite sure of exactly where Denman was at this point, but we do know that she's in conversation with Van Loo. But as you get into the letter, maybe halfway through or so, you start to notice there's a bit of tension that's prevalent in their relationship. Um, you know, Van Loo is, of course, reaching out to support. There's a reference to Van Loo sending some assistance, some money to Denman to help her while she is, I believe, somewhere up north. And so she thanks Van Loo, but also sort of early on in the letter apologizes to her for not using that money that she was sent according to how Van Loo wanted to be used. There's record of her using it to pay off some debt and to buy some necessities that she needed to survive while she's up north. And as the letter goes on, we get the sense that some of the language speaks to a bit of resentment and sort of distancing from Denman, to keep herself away from Van Loo a little bit. Um, so as it says here on the slide, Denman resists Van Loo's quote unquote charitable support in favor of striking out on her own. Quote, "It would be unwomanly of me to become so dependent on anyone. As long as I can get an existence for myself, I must try." She goes on to describe herself as too peculiar to room with anyone, which sort of alludes to the type of living situation that Van Loo was extending to her, that she would not actually have her own quarters, that there would be someone else, or at least multiple people that she would be rooming with. Um, and so beyond that, we see that Denman's trying to sort of stand in her independence. At this point, she's, close to about 30 years of age, and she's being told that she can return back to the Van Loo household under some different circumstances and lodging considerations. But one thing that comes up towards the end of the letter is this quote that's at the bottom of the page. If I ever came to your house and you ever told me of what you had done for me, I should wish myself anywhere else except there. And so, Denman repeats a couple times of how Van Loo has, not hesitated to remind her of the charity and the support she's given. And I'm not sure about any of you, but if you had a friend who did something nice for you, and every time you did something they didn't want you to do, or whatever, they threw that nice thing back in your face, that's not someone that I would consider much of a friend. So a lot of this charity that she's receiving from Van Loo has this sort of air of control a bit to it. And so the tension in this letter becomes quite palatable. Like you can feel how frustrated Denman is with Van Loo and sort of how she's been regarded and how she's been treated, even though, because she was not compensated after her work in the resistance against the Confederacy, she does still need Van Loo for support from time to time. So this, I think, is part of that story of how her, Denman or Mary Bowser's image is sort of inflated to this superwoman, superhuman spy, of the Civil War, to actually seeing what this relationship was like to be connected to Elizabeth Van Loo. And it wasn't necessarily the most positive of connections. And of course, not to, demonize Van Loo at all, but it wasn't what we tend to think of when we think about Mary Bowser. We think of this person who sort of had this gumption and this bravery, but we don't necessarily know or are familiar with exactly what her life was like on an everyday basis. So on to the next slide, please. So this is a photo or a depiction of the Battle of Hampton Roads, the Monitor and the Merrimack, or the Monitor and the CSS Virginia, which, I think for those of us who are familiar with this battle, we know, it's a stalemate, but the Confederates were unable to advance because of this sort of battle of these two ironclads, which is kind of the beginning or the sort of the spark of naval technology and sort of ironclad ships, which is, quite remarkable. But one thing that what has come up in my research, is that this story is missing a very key player that most folks don't know about. And I had known about her for a long time myself. And so we can jump down to the next slide, please. And there we go. So the person that's missing from this story is a Black woman named Mary Touvestre. So here we're going to start with the census from 1860. And this is just of her household at the time. She's 40 years old. Her husband is 45 years old. He was born in Haiti. She's born in Virginia. And then she has her child, Susan. And then later on in a different census, she has a grandchild named Robert. Prior to this particular census, there's another person in her household who's listed as being Mark de Morty, and this person was listed as her enslaved. To kind of get some context there, it's not likely that she would have enslaved another person. This young child was more than likely purchased out of slavery to be cared for in her household. I think his sister was also purchased out of slavery by a nearby neighbor relative. So I just wanted to address that really quickly. And so a lot of the documents that we have that I've been able to find about Mary Touvestre actually came from Troy Vallos, who works at a library down in Norfolk, who has done an amazing job with finding these records and just sort of seeking her out. So he absolutely has been an angel for me in my research in this case. But so as we talk about Mary Touvestre, we're kind of going to go over exactly what her role was as it pertains to the Battle of Hampton Roads. So we go down to the next slide. So here's exactly what Mary Touvestre did. This is a letter from Gideon Wells, who was the Secretary of the Navy at the time. And he says here that in 1861-62, the winter, a Black woman comes up to DC and delivers, information to him about the USS Virginia that's being built, the ironclad ship that's being built. Now, they knew at the time that there was an ironclad being built somewhere. They didn't know how far along it was in its completion, and how, how much artillery it had and how many cannons it was able to fire. So Mary comes along really in the nick of time to deliver this information to Wells, and she boldly asks to speak to no one but him. So he had to, of course, trust that she had something to say and that she had something to deliver. Um, and in this letter, he acknowledges that, can you pop back to the previous slide for me, please? Thanks. He acknowledges that she does come at no small risk to bring this material to him. And it is, of course, exactly what they need to know about this ship. And they're able to then fortify their own vessel to be able to sort of withstand the attack they're going to receive. So you can jump down. So again, from the previous slide, she had these plans from a mechanic that she knew was able to get those to Washington, D.C. So this is a letter from Louvestre, and this is something that we are, it's rare to kind of get this type of correspondence from an African American woman to an official within this particular conflict. And so she's been in contact with a Commodore Kilty regarding her actions and activities, and she's able to sort of write to get and say, yes, I'm the person that you're looking for. It's me. You found me. And she does, take a moment here to sort of address that she's going through, at this point in 1868, she's going through a bit of financial turmoil. And she asks for some sort of support for her service, which again is a very bold ask of a Black woman at this time. And then if we jump to the next slide, this is sort of the handwritten version of that letter, also provided by Mr. Vallos and his excellent research. And then jump down one more time. Okay. So this is a letter from Wells to Kilty, I believe. And this is sort of to confirm that, Louvestre did do what everyone has so far said that she did. And instead it reads, on the occasion of your last visit to this yard, you made particular inquiries concerning a colored woman who had conveyed valuable information from Norfolk to the government authorities during the late war. So we've confirmed that she's actually been this person who's able to deliver this information to the proper authorities in order to sort of have an effect on the Battle of Hampton Roads, which, if we consult much of the information written about this particular battle, she's nowhere to be found. So this is an instance where we're seeing that invisibility creep up, where someone who has this very important role within this particular moment in history, but it's been erased completely, almost completely, I should say, from sort of popular knowledge and public memory. And so to have these records to confirm that not only did this person, Mary Louvestre, exist, was she, she was a shopkeeper, she had a large family, she had a long life, she was able to correspond with very important folks within our government. They were aware of her, but she did really do these things, and she had a profound impact on the outcome of that particular point of the conflict. Which again, while it was sort of a stalemate, it did sort of keep the Confederates at bay without sort of being able to access and sort of cause additional damage to the Union fleet. We could jump down to our next slide. So in a bit of a closing, I did mention that.
Well, thank you so much, Brittany. For our members, feel free to add your questions to the Q&A or to the chat. And I see that we do have a couple that are have already been asked here. So question is, will this presentation be available for participants afterwards? Yes, we have recorded it. So we will share the recording with the registrants via email afterwards. So that was a wonderful presentation, Brittany. So I know that we'll want to be able to reference that. And then we have a specific one about Mariah Stewart, the first woman you referenced at the beginning. During which years did Mariah Stewart teach Black women to write and advocate on behalf of themselves?
So the society began in 1832. I couldn't find any records on exactly how long the society was sort of functioning, but her ongoing work as an educator, of course, included educating adults and children in literacy and sort of not just becoming literate, but how to fine tune their writing and their practice of writing. So um, I don't have an exact answer of exactly how long the society was in active society, but it did begin in 1832.
Wonderful, thank you. And then I have so the convention that you mentioned at the beginning of the program. How long was that? An ongoing organization, or did it meet once for that one convention? And if it did meet for a longer time, how long did it exist?
So the records for many of the colored conventions, they tend to fizzle out over time. So we have those beginning documents of the Constitution, the bylaws, and sort of the minutes from those first conventions. But what tends to happen is that these sort of organizations morph into each other. So that first one, beginning in 1830 with that first meeting was actually the second meeting after the first one. So it gets a bit convoluted exactly how long these conventions go on. They tend to merge, they tend to fade out and kind of keep going. There's some records from that very first, the American Society of Free Persons of Color, that morphs into a different organization. So that has different dates as it moves forward. So that particular convention, it's very difficult to say, but by the mid 1860s, most of them had fizzled out for different sort of initiatives once that sort of purpose was served.
Okay, and please feel free. We have got a couple more minutes of the program if you have any more questions to add them in. And I do apologize if you can hear the rumbles that are happening behind me. We have some construction going on at the building, so hopefully it's not too loud. And then I do have another question in here. And this is for you, Brittany, about your life. So what led you to work in museums? You mentioned that you had studied anthropology. So what fostered that interest for you?
So when I was in undergrad, and I majored in anthropology and bioarchaeology is my focus. A lot of the information that I was coming across were things that I hadn't grown up learning about, and that my friends and classmates hadn't learned about. So I thought of ways to share that information. What would be the best course of action to get that information to as many people as possible? Initially I thought of going into sort of academia and becoming a professor, but then there are barriers to, some people can't go or afford college, or they can't go, or they can't go to that particular university you may be working for. But I thought, well, I thought back to when I was a kid, and the first time I remember going to a museum, it was the Field Museum in Chicago, and there was this exhibit where you got to kind of dig in this kind of sand pit to find artifacts, and I had to be like taken from the from that exhibition. Like my teacher had to come get me out of this thing, and I thought, well, that was the way that I was first introduced to archaeology as a 6-year-old, and I turned out to become an archaeologist, and so maybe museums would be the way to share the history that I was able to learn about. And, for me being African American, a lot of my ancestry and my heritage is tied up in such a way that, I wasn't able to learn about lots of things when I was in school. So I can only imagine how other generations felt about not knowing, whether they were, what regardless of what race they were, people want to know about history and everyone's history. So, I felt like it was, part of my duty to be a historian and to, respect my ancestors and my heritage by sharing these stories and sharing them in a way that, being of the descendant community, there are pieces of information I can get to. There are different ways of finding out information, not just using archives and sort of the traditional academic route, that this could be helpful to someone. It could be, there could be another 6-year-old kid that comes to a museum and finds something that I've done, and they become a historian and archaeologist. So I felt like this was a way for me to use and share what I've been learning, but also to kind of be a bridge to other folks who maybe want to kind of get into this industry.
That's great. Okay, so we do have a few more questions here that we'll cover, and then I do want to honor people's time. But we've got some great questions coming in. So we have one. Do you have ideas or theories about what Mary Bowser actually did? For example, did she actually work in Jefferson Davis's household, in your view?
From what I've been able to sort of collect, I believe she did work in his household. But, it's very difficult to say. I can't really put it together myself. I know that Lois Levine, who's sort of the leading scholar on Mary Bowser or Mary Denman's life, um, she's done sort of a fictionalized work to kind of piece together some of her life. But I think it's hard to really say without sort of having that documentation or having something coming from Bowser herself. She did at one point go on like I guess a speaking tour following the war, and she changed her name a couple times. But one record was the name Richmonia Richards, where she spoke, and there's an article in the New York Times from that speech where she talked about what she did. But again, do we how do we confirm a lot of those things? Of course, that speaking circuit does tend to have some sensationalized stories in it, but it's hard to really say exactly what she did.
Thank you. Okay, and so the next question is, what role, if any, do slave narratives play in your research? I know what freed Blacks and more had more freedom to challenge existing social and political structures, but I am interested in your ideas about the role and function of slave narratives as part of as part of the history of Black women and their contributions.
So there's, of course, the WPA, the sort of oral history interviews that were done in the 1930s of formerly enslaved folks, and those, they're very telling. They're all cataloged at the Library of Congress, so you can always just look those up. But even in those conversations, a lot of the interviewers were not Black, so they weren't as forthcoming about information as they may have been with different interviewers. So that's one way to kind of figure out exactly what's going on or have more insight. But a lot of what sort of archaeology does for us is that where things may have been included from the historical record, the physical record, the archaeological record can give us items and materials that can be interpreted from a cultural perspective. So that's sort of why archaeology is quite important to my research as a historian, because I can interpret materials that maybe don't have a written record to support what's going on, but they have a cultural record that I may be aware of, or a colleague may be aware of, to be able to sort of interpret those things. So for me, archaeology presents an opportunity to create or to access, another primary source, which would be material culture. So that's the way I kind of engage, and then you kind of backtrack from there. One example like I've been engaging with lately is with religion of enslaved people. And so those religions still exist today. They're still in practice. There are still practitioners who, you know, numerous, especially in states like Virginia and other states in the South. So that knowledge does, of course, help us understand what belief systems were like. And when you think about archaeology, the historical record is the stuff that you kind of want people to know, but the things that you leave behind in your house or in your trash or you bury under your floorboards are the things you don't want them to know, which may be a bit more informative than what you would find written down somewhere.
All right, we have one last question here. So to take us home, Brittany, how can we connect or follow your work? And a follow-up here is, if you can you talk about what you're working on right now at the VMHC?
I think I can talk about what I'm working on. So I have a few projects I'm working on. One is actually, having to deal with African American historical archaeology with DHR, the Department of Historical Resources, and that's going to sort of be coming up later on this year. I don't know how much I can actually say about it, but it does discuss a little bit of enslaved religions and religious practices and sort of how we use material culture to identify and understand those sort of hidden realities. I'm also working on an exhibition that uses sort of everyday, household objects we all have in our homes or in our living rooms to provide different perspectives of interpretation. So one of those objects is a Navy hat, a cap, and we understand that there's the object history that we have in our records of the donor and who used to own this cap. Then we have like this larger history that I relate to. There's the Tidewater region, and how that relates to Filipino Americans' naval service and sort of the history and culture around that. And I was able to interview a fantastic scholar and educator and activist, Ray Obispo, who spoke about his father and his uncle's service and how that changed his life and how that sort of becomes part of his culture. So those are two of the projects I'm working on quite a bit right now. Another other projects that are coming up as well. But for me, I mean, I'm at the museum and I do have a Twitter page that I don't really use very often. If anyone wants to follow me on Twitter, it's at curatorial curls, obvious reasons. So I can be reached there. I'm always happy to chat about history, things that I don't know, because I think part of being a curator is not only engaging with people and their stories, but we're lifelong learners. Like, you can be an expert at one or two things, but there's so much you can learn from just talking to folks. And I love that part of the job.
Yes, I think that's definitely something to be said. You can always learn more, especially in museums and especially with history. Well, to honor everyone's time, I do want to stop the questions. As Brittany mentioned, she's got her Twitter page, which we can link to when we send the recording of the email of the program via email. And I'll also include Brittany's email here at the VMHC if you have specific questions. Before we wrap up, I do want to say thank you so much to Brittany. We're so glad to have you on staff. And that was certainly, I learned a lot too in this program. So that's wonderful. Some housekeeping things for upcoming events at the museum. We are reopening several of our galleries and exhibitions on July 1. So members, please come out and visit us again. We have some of our building will still be under construction, but you can come see the story of Virginia. We will have a new partner exhibition with the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia called Partners in History that will be opening on July 1. And then we are also having our citizenship ceremony on July 4th. That will be held outside on our front lawn on Arthur Ashe Boulevard. So please feel free to come out in the morning, wear your sunscreen and bring a hat. And we will have that on July 4th. We're so excited to have that again this year. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say, as always, thank you so much for your continued support as members. We certainly couldn't do what we do without you. And we hope very much to see you at the museum again soon. So if there are any further questions, you can always reach out to us via email. And again, thank you so much to Brittany and to Haley, who's our magician behind the scenes, who makes sure that these programs go so smoothly. So thank you all so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.